Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And this is our final discussion group gathering inspired by Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope. It's been a real pleasure to spend many Wednesday evenings with all of you, both via Zoom and some in person at the Boardman Library. Tonight we have two delightful guests from Vassar College, who I will introduce in a minute. But I just wanted to tell everyone who's on the call so far, whoops, let me admit a few more folks here. I wanted just remind everyone that this is our final discussion, Wednesday night discussion group. What we do have remaining in June is our garden visits. So when I send you the next email, which will probably be next Wednesday, I will send you a description of all the gardens that we have an option of going to see and the dates that we'll be doing that. The dates are in late June, so you don't have to worry that you're going to miss anything. And I think that's it. We are recording tonight. Please keep your mics muted. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box or make a note of what you want to ask. We will have time for question and answer after the two presentations. So tonight, first of all, we're going to have Vassar College Geography Professor Marianne Cunningham. She is also Director of Environmental Studies, and she's going to be speaking first, and then we will have Micah Kenfield. He is the Vassar College Director of Sustainability. So welcome, Marianne and Micah. And Marianne, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you. And we look forward to hearing from you.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation, and thank you for inspiring me to read this book. It was a really enjoyable book, and made me think about a lot of things, including the issue of sort of wildlife and biodiversity and where it happens and why it happens and so on. I guess I should say that in terms of the kinds of issues that I like to spend time studying and thinking about with students, a lot of it has to do with sort of larger processes of landscape change and how that influences biodiversity. And I think that for me, as I was reading Tallamy's book, and of course I'm coming to that book a lot behind you, you've talked about a lot of the issues already, and I know that. But for me, you know, the connection to the individual actions and how we can modify our own landscapes that we have control over was really interesting. And also the details in the landscape, the details in biodiversity change that are sometimes hard to perceive and surprising, I think that was also really valuable. And so that's a little bit of sort of where I'm trying to come at this right now. So I guess one of the things that I think is important that was in the book, but is always some sort of surprising to me, is how adaptable wildlife really is. And especially not all species, not necessarily monarch butterflies or invertebrates that are obligatory to one particular plant species, but a lot of wildlife is. This is a picture that I took a couple of years ago, right in the middle of Northeast Minneapolis, in front of Hazel's Cafe. And we asked the person in the cafe, like, there's turkeys outside. She said, oh yeah, they're always here. And it's not just these wildlife, there's a lot of bird life. There are a lot of, you know, you probably have deer in your own backyard in Poughkeepsie. I don't know, I do at least. So the degree to which wildlife is able to adapt to different situations is really interesting. Another bird that we had in our yard here in this situation was Cooper's hawks, which are really well known. You may have Cooper's hawks in your yard. And you know, 30 years ago, those were declining, uncommon, out of the way species, maybe more than 30 years ago, but they've adapted to the suburbs and they've adapted to the city, and they've figured out how how to survive. Peregrine falcons the same way. And there's quite a bit of wildlife that has figured out how to adapt to unusual landscapes, let's say. And another thing that I think is really interesting is the degree to which ecosystems and biodiversity can be really surprisingly resilient given a chance. And so this is one case that's familiar to me because this is about where I live, and it's on the edge of the Vassar campus. And this is a 1936 air photo from the Dutchess County Planning Department aerial access website. And so you can go to the aerial access online and find a place that you're familiar with and see how it's changed in historical photos from 1936 going forward. So this is 1936. You can see a lot of orchards in the upper right corner. Oops, sorry. You can see a lot of orchards in the upper right corner. This is a big sort of pasture field sort of a thing with some stone walls and so on. But it's a pretty open landscape, wooded over here, open here, some trees, some orchards. And orchards, you know, are lovely for us. They're not great for biodiversity, not that many different species in because not that many different plants. Here's a 1940s photo of the same place, that same yellow outline. And see the orchard's about the same. The trees are starting to encroach into the old field. And so there's still a fair bit of opening. 1955, it's hard to see in this photo because of the season the photo was taken, but it's a lot of deciduous forest filling in that same area. Some houses filling in various parts of the photo. Here's more houses filling in and more deciduous trees that you can sort of see the ghosty shapes. These are taken in the winter or the fall when the leaves are off, and so it's a little hard to see where the deciduous trees are. But so this forest is kind of filling in by 1970-ish, plus or minus. But meanwhile, the suburban yards are expanding in other parts of the area. By 1995, the orchards are gone. The yards are expanding. Here, the bright green vegetation is showing up as bright red. And the coniferous dark green forest is showing up as bright red here as well. And so it's pretty well wooded, right? So from 1936 to 1995, it's pretty much a transition in this little area from pretty open to pretty wooded. And here's a 2004 photo. And I put some circles around some of the areas down here where for between 2004 and 2020, the landscape opened up quite a lot and houses were built. So 2004 to 2020, this is the suburban landscape that Tallamy's writing about that we all aspire to. We want to have a large open lawn, which we mow every week. And we've increased the acreage of open areas around this area quite a bit and lost quite a lot of wooded habitat. And so that's something that I think is important. And so just to compare, so going back to 1940s, it was just growing in 2020. So 1940s, that was actually like late 40s, 47, 48. So we're talking sort of 50 years plus or minus. It's gone from pretty open to pretty wooded, right? So 50 years, is that a long time? Is that a little time? I don't know, right? But on nature's time, it's not that long of a time span. So the resilience of the forest landscape when left idle is I think, a really interesting thing to be aware of. Within that area, I told you this is an area that I live in now. We were lucky enough to sort of get to be able to get a house in that area. And so this is a list. This is a list of our yard birds. So our yard birds start with, and this is not in taxonomic order. So all you ornithologists are going to see they're all out of order because I put pileated woodpeckers first because they're most exciting. And I also love the red-bellieds and the hares and the downies. And we get flickers as well. And we get turkeys and we get gray-crested flycatchers living in the yard right now. And peewees and tanagers. We get wood thrushes every evening in the summer, right? Lots of red-breasted grosbeaks around. We get some pretty quality yard birds, is my point. And it's very exciting to get this many quality yard birds. We also get a lot of migrants. So this past couple of weeks or so, we've been getting thrushes and woodcocks and quite a lot of different warblers. This is the warblers that I'm not really good at detecting warblers. So this is a subset of them, I'm sure. And so we've got a pretty good quality set of migrants that are coming through this wooded area too. This is not a huge wooded area. This is a fairly little wooded area encroached upon by suburban yards. And yet it's getting a pretty good collection of birds. Incidentally, we also get migrant and occasional, or we get occasional house sparrow, European starling, brown-headed cowbird, American crow, fish crow. These are the urban birds, the ones that are not that exciting to be seeing if you're looking for native birds, because several of them are European varieties, and they're very urban adapted, but they are not getting themselves into that little patch of woods, which I think is a really interesting thing, at least not much. In addition, I put a few other things, like flying squirrels are amazing. I don't see them very often, but they're there. We also get things like different kinds of frogs, garter snakes, milk snakes, and then fireflies, hawk moths, and then ... My ability to detect the smaller things is limited. Like birds are easy; they sing and you can hear them, and they're easy to identify. And fireflies and hawk moths, I was really impressed at reading Tallamy's book at the level of detail he was detecting, and this is something that I have not figured out yet. But we suspect there's a lot of diversity there as well. Okay, so I think one of the things to keep in mind is that there's a lot of sort of resilience that we can see here. I think another point that I was thinking about a lot as I was reading the book is that as we think about transitions in the landscape and transitions that influence biodiversity, it's not always easy to perceive risk factors either. Like I just said, I'm not good at perceiving invertebrate diversity, and I'm not very good at a lot of amphibians. But similarly, there are other things in the landscape like risk factors that are really hard for me to perceive. So I can see when there's trees, and I can see when there's lawns, and I can approximate what kinds of biodiversity might be associated. As I sort of think about conservation strategies and what might influence conservation, those are things that I can evaluate. As I think about other risk factors for birds in this case, this is a graph of mortality causes, estimates of mortality causes for birds in millions of birds per year. And these are very broad estimates, right? So there's a lot of talk about wind turbines, which are definitely a new concern and not to be trivialized, but compared to building collisions, we're talking, orders of magnitude difference possibly. It's really hard to know. Oil and gas, how many of us think on a daily basis about the oil and gas wastewater pits that are associated with oil and gas production, communication towers, coal plants, utility lines, pesticides? Vehicles cause a lot of mortality for birds. So as we're thinking about landscape change and conservation of biodiversity, the extent and expansion of roads is also a really important consideration, right? And so, as we think about planning, as we think about conservation, this is an important sort of question that we don't necessarily perceive because it's so much all around us. And that's kind of where I want to go to. Another thing that's all around us, of course, is our house cats. And this is just an arrow that's out to the right because we're talking vehicles are estimated to be sort of in the 100 to 300 million bird mortalities per year, and house cats are something around 1,000 to 4,000 million birds. So we're talking in the billions. And I say this, I put this in because I showed it to my class just last week. But I also put it in because I love my cat. And when I was a kid, we always had cats going outside. And they brought back all sorts of birds. And they brought back bunnies. And my dad was glad they brought back bunnies that ate the tomatoes in the garden. So, but nowadays, I've started to read articles about this, and we keep our cat indoors. And he's actually just totally fine with that. So just a pitch for keep your cat indoors as we think about biodiversity conservation, especially, I'm living in this wooded area surrounded by lawns. We have a lot of neighboring cats coming visit our feeders. Should we be having feeders up so that we can see all these great birds when we have neighbor cats coming? I don't know, right? So understanding relative risk factors is just another thing to think about as we think about biodiversity. Not in that list because it's too big even to think about is landscape change and conversion to agriculture. These are center pivot circles for irrigation in Texas where they're producing cotton. The world has a global glut of cotton and has for decades, but we're using irrigation of scarce water in the Southwest to produce cotton and to replace former grasslands. So this is one of those big process things that makes a big difference in biodiversity. And all these little dots here, these little white dots, if you can see them, those are oil and gas drilling points. And there's millions of them across the landscape in the American West and other regions. And each of those has one of those wastewater pits on it. And each of those wastewater pits or has had at some point, and those pits are a huge mortality for wildlife and birds because they're contaminated. So this is a big process, it's a big structural process that needs to be thought of as we think about sort of global scale biodiversity conservation, I think. And it's easy not to perceive it because it's background. It's not in my backyard, I don't see it. I can go to Google Maps and find this pretty easily if I take the time and look for it. And if I lived in Plains, Texas, then it would be normal. It would just be whatever. I wouldn't be thinking about it. So when we think about sort of the relationship between sort of what can we do and what's a big 30 by 30 biodiversity agenda, this sort of hard to perceive risk factor, I think, is a big part of the question. I don't have an answer, but it's just something that I think about and worry, I wonder about. And I guess the last thing I would say, and I'm not quite sure how I'm doing on time, but this is the last thing that I would say is for a 30 by 30 agenda, there's always the issue of what individual actions can accomplish and what larger structural changes can accomplish, right? And the great thing about Tallamy's book is he's talking about the things that we can do as individuals, and that's empowering. So that's great. It's small. It's each of us doing our own backyard, and that adds up and multiplies, and that's great. I think also a lot of it is about education and sort of learning. Sort of the more we learn in our own backyard, the more empowered we are to try to influence the changes on larger scales. And I think that's like a really, really important thing. So the learning, the individual learning, I think, is an important part of this whole process, is an important component. At the same time, we do need the structural changes so that it's easy to do the right thing, so that we're not struggling against, social mores or legal rules or zoning rules, homeowner associations that say you have to mow your yard, you can't let it grow back up as scrubby old fields. And so figuring out those structural things are key in order to make it do the right thing. So in a sense, like the 30 by 30 compact among countries is encouraging countries to stand up together and do the right thing while they're looking at each other. Like as I try to let my yard be a wildlife yard, and Micah is over there mowing his yard and saying that's weird, right? Like we're having a little competition. If Micah and I both are in the same structure of expectations, and we both think that the thing to do is to allow some space for wildlife in our yards, then we're not going to argue about that. It's going to be much easier for both of us to do that without friction. And so I think that's a really important thing. Just one sort of component to that. This is the cover of Michael Pollan's Second Nature book from about 1993, which some of you may have read. This was my introduction to Michael Pollan, and I still love the book. But the cover, and the new cover is different, but the old cover had this path through a wild field. And part of his point was that if you have a little bit of intentionality in the landscape, then you can let the rest of it be sort of artistically unkempt. And that's okay because you're showing intentionality. And in 1993, this was sort of a radical idea. And nowadays, it's a much less radical idea. It's become much more normal. And so this is some of that individual learning that I think contributes to the larger structural changes and helps us all sort of participate in and empower those larger structural changes. I think maybe I will let it rest there and see if Micah wants to have a turn or how else you want to proceed.
All right. Thank you. Is there anyone that has a burning question right now for Marianne, or before we go on to Micah? I do not see anything in the chat, and let's see, I'm not seeing everybody right now. Marianne, can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, seeing no one, I think we're going to go on and turn things over to Micah, and save up your questions, folks, and we'll have time at the end. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to build a little bit off of what Marianne already has shared to talk specifically about the 30 by 30 initiative, or really 30 by 30 initiatives, because there's a few different approaches currently going on, but I'll just share screen. And also, again, tie it back to one of the things that I loved most about the book, which was, really focusing on the local action. I know growing up, I always kind of hated cliches like think globally, act locally. And as I have aged, you begin to realize how many cliches are cliches for a reason, because they've got a lot going for them. So to just kind of start with what the 30 by 30 campaign is, or who's involved. There's a lot of people. The main 30 by 30 campaign, if you will, is something that's been sparked by the Convention on Biological Diversity. That's a UN body. They have 193 parties. There are only 4 nations or nation groups that have not signed on to it. That's the Vatican, Andorra, South Sudan, and the United States. But that was originally a 1994 convention, with all nations on that list agreeing to set aside 17% of their land and 10% of their oceans by 2020. They recently issued a framework about a year ago for the 30 by 30 initiative, or campaign, if you will. That's going to be considered later this year by the full group, but right now it's kind of in a working draft, working paper state. But it's still a really good idea. And you see a number of other groups really jumping onto it. There's a group called the High Ambition Coalition, which is 60 nations who have specifically pledged to really take point on driving this together. France and Costa Rica are co-chairing it, with England, or the United Kingdom, serving as a co-chair specifically for a piece on ocean preservation, not so much the land preservation piece, but the ocean preservation. There's also the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which includes over 1,400 member organizations, including many national governments, non-governmental associations, and more. And most recently, via executive order, a non-international version, but the White House, who you are probably familiar with. But in addition to that, there's also a number of non-governmental organizations that are actively working on these same sorts of issues and pushing their own 30 by 30 initiatives. Just to come up with a few, one of the biggest ones is the Campaign for Nature, really being spearheaded by National Geographic and the Vice campaign. There's also a group called the Resources Legacy Fund, which supports both the global efforts, but even more directly, the American Nature Campaign, really advocating for that 30 by 30 target within the United States. The Wilderness Society, which is again supporting both, but really focusing on American efforts. And Oceans Unite, which is, as you would probably expect, very, very focused on the oceans piece of preservation. But the 30 by 30 framework itself, really pretty self-explanatory, is about protecting 30% of the world's land, as well as 30% of the world's oceans, no later than 2030. Putting that in context, right now, worldwide, only about 13% of all land and 2% of all oceans are protected as no-take reserves. As of a 2018 report from the Center for American Progress, America only preserved about 12% of its land and 26% of its oceans. That was in 2018, though, and as you might suspect, there were some policy changes during the two following years, if you will, that have reduced that even further. But one of the big things about the 30 by 30 framework as well, that a number of the groups I just mentioned have really been pushing, and I think was touched on in the book as well, is that it's not just about protecting land, it's about protecting the right land. You know, as you see, even a lot of the American land that's currently protected are mountains, which I absolutely love, especially growing up in very flat Southeast Texas. They are so inspiring. I love them, but they're not the kind of arable land. They're not as vital necessarily to some aspects of the landscape, at least, as other areas. And so, just as the book mentioned, you really need a piece of all different land types. And a number of the international groups are talking about not just preserving 30% of each nation's land kind of willy-nilly, if you will, but focusing on it being the right kind of land. And when you're talking global efforts, arranging it so maybe some countries are preserving more than 30% of their land, others are doing less, but really focusing on what's best for global biodiversity. And as was recently shown, the US has committed to a 30 by 30 effort. That's not directly rejoining those international efforts or joining in the first place. It's instead something that was accomplished via executive order. In this case, it's really asking the Secretary of the Interior to work with Secretary of Agriculture and a bunch of other secretaries and department heads to come up with plans for America to conserve 30% of its land by 2030. As you might know, this approach sometimes has drawbacks. So just very briefly going back to the Paris Agreement, in 2016, the United States joined the Paris Agreement via executive order. Not that long after, it was announced that the United States was withdrawing. And more recently, as we've seen, the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, which is great. But that part I don't think is nearly as exciting as what happened in between. Some of you may have heard of it, but there was a group called the We Are Still In Coalition, which ultimately ended up being, I'm going to read off the list now to catch them all, over 2,300 businesses and investors, almost 300 cities and counties, 412 colleges and universities, including Vassar, 87 cultural institutions, including museums, other centers for the arts, and so forth, 44 healthcare groups, 947 faith groups, 10 states, and 12 tribes, all joining together to essentially say, even if the United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, we are each going to set ambitious climate goals so we can meet or exceed those targets on our own levels. And so, running through what that includes, obviously, it's the different groups pledging to meet their Paris Agreement goals. And even though we've rejoined the Paris Agreement, these groups are still continuing to pursue those goals themselves, and even have started to push for more aggressive climate action through a spin-off campaign called America's All In. So it's something where even if we were to leave the Paris Agreement, again, fingers crossed it won't happen, but if something like that happened, these are frameworks that were established in so many cases at the city level, at the town level, at the individual level, but have still managed to keep America on track for a lot of its Paris Agreement targets. And that kind of ties in, just to wrap things up, really on where I think so much of the importance can happen through local action. So as I understand, over the last few months, you've been talking about things like, I'll use pollinators as an easy example. You can plant them in your yard. So you can plant them kind of in your communities. And when you're doing that, you're not just doing something for the environment yourself, you're also learning the ins and outs, kind of like, as Marianne mentioned, of how pollinators work, of their value. You have a hands-on experience and a much deeper knowledge, which makes it a lot easier for you, if you so choose, to be an advocate for it, either directly to a municipality or on your own in your community. This is an example from the Xerxes Foundation of, I know it's kind of tiny print there, but the many different types of pollinator pockets that can show up in a city and the different ways that cities can work towards that. And when you look at how that impact gets done, cities themselves are represented by legislators who go on to move to statewide policy. And so this is, I believe as of 2019, every single state you see in purple there has a law on the books specifically about preservation of pollinators, pollinator habitats, and so on and so forth. And just to give you, I mean, as you can see, that's not one specific kind of cultural background, if you will, to talk slightly euphemistically. This is a huge range of a huge number of different states, different political bodies, different leanings, if you will. But it's everything from New York, which has set aside specific financial resources for restoration of pollinators. Connecticut has a group of experts and a pollinator advisory board, if you will. Oklahoma has it charged its state board of agriculture to create a pollinator protection plan in order to protect the health and mitigate risks to honeybees and other managed pollinators. And Ohio has a number of different policies, including when they're looking at transportation policy, making sure they're not disturbing pollinator corridors, preserving Ohio's monarch butterflies. They even have a native plant month in Ohio, which is something I did not know and is very exciting. But it's the sort of thing that starts with local action, and regardless of the nature of your community, can go up to be something much bigger. Just to use very briefly one last New York example, the village of Hastings-on-Hudson recently passed a resolution supporting something called low embodied carbon concrete. It's a way to build much, much more sustainably. They're kind of an incubator for using it, but it's led to a law or an act that's currently being considered, a bill, that's what it's called. I remember Schoolhouse Rock, that's currently in the state Senate that's under consideration, that would be a huge move forward for the state of New York in supporting something that could construct or cut construction emissions statewide by 40% as much. Huge impact, starting with a village just a little bit south of here. And so I'll just leave you with one last image, again, touching on the themes that Marianne discussed. It's one of my absolute favorite pictures that I've taken, at least. This is from Overlook Mountain. It's right around the Woodstock area. It's something that it's a place I visited maybe 2 months after I started at Vassar a few years ago. This area was clear cut from the 1820s to the 1920s, was resort, huge wide paths, so on and so forth. What you see there are basically the last remains of one of the big resorts. It was struck by lightning 3 times in a row, and I'm not going to editorialize too much on what nature might have been trying to say there, but after a while, it was abandoned. It turned into a preserve. And this is less than a century of growth. When I visited, I did not know the background. I got up to the top and saw the poster. I would have thought this was much older, but I guess, I know people say things like nature is healing and things like that, but it really speaks to me as something where, as we take these deliberate actions, so much of what's going on, there's a huge importance to climate action, but it's also not like things are broken beyond repair. And the work we're doing today can still lead to the sort of impacts that we need. And so it's exciting to me. I'm happy to kind of move us over to Q&A. Yeah, that's what I got.
Terrific. Thank you. All right, folks. I don't see anything in the chat, but I'm going to encourage you to be thinking about your questions, and I'm going to start just by asking Micah to tell me a little bit about what a director of sustainability on a college campus does.
Oh gosh, a lot more than I expected when I applied for the job, I'll tell you that much. So a lot of my immediate work is working with Vassar's climate action plan. So last year, we put together a plan to cover 5 years of action between 2020 and 2025, looking at all of the different pieces of campus sustainability. So some of the big ones you'd think of, things like energy procurement. We're going to 100% green electricity as of 5 weeks from now. Wow, time flies. But we'll be 100% renewable for our electricity. We're moving to cut our facility emissions, burn less stuff in general, but also work with greening our fleet, work with what we're calling restorative land management guidelines that we'll be developing over the next couple of years to go beyond. You see a lot of places that have like green landscaping guidelines, and it's just thou shalt not use this substance, you should only purchase these. And we're looking at, I mean, that is a component, but also how we can adapt the Vassar campus to really fill the same kind of ecological functions it was 160 years ago before Matthew Vassar, felled the first tree or laid the first brick, of how we can fit that among a bunch of other stuff. We just rolled out new standardized recycling bins across campus. I have talked so much about waste diversion lately. I will leave it there because it comes up a lot. But, it's a little bit of everything, but it's really kind of focusing on that holistic goal of both helping Vassar get to carbon neutrality by 2030, but also, building a campus that's more sustainable on the whole, and even starting to look at opportunities we have to work with the community at large to amplify our impact even further.
And is this would you say that just about any college campus has a director of sustainability? Is this a very common thing?
So I started my career in Texas, so I won't say every college campus has something like that. Not to pick on the Lone Star State, but I lived there for 2 decades and I can. But I would say it's increasingly common. Some schools don't have it directly as a director position. Some have a sustainability coordinator. Some people have it built in different ways. It's not absolutely everywhere, but it is something you see happening a lot more commonly. As I briefly mentioned, over 400 universities signed on to the We Are Still In commitment to reduce global emissions by 2050. Doing that takes a lot of work. And so having somebody to coordinate those efforts is really big. And so I think we're seeing a trend. More and more universities have them, even with recent budget cuts that impacted a number of universities globally, given the recent unpleasantness of the last 16 months, to use a euphemism. You typically didn't see sustainability budgets completely slashed because there were still these kinds of big picture goals and a knowledge that momentum needed to continue. That's a very long way of saying basically yes, but basically yes.
Okay.
I would maybe add in that this is actually a fairly new thing. I mean, I think it's really common to have this position, but I think it hasn't been that way for a long time. I know Vassar is probably, I don't know, middle of the pack somewhere. A decade ago, we had a post-bac position, like a student graduated and then took the job for a while. Previous to that, and that lasted actually up until Micah came. So up until just a few years ago, and so it was a pretty good position, but it was not as high administratively as Micah's position. It was like at least a little bit lower. Micah's right at the top. No, Micah is a big step above where the position was previously, and before that, it was a faculty member in their spare time, and you know how much spare time faculty have. So we're not there yet, but it's progress. It's real progress, I think.
I was sort of guessing that maybe a decade was the time frame of when this kind of position showed up in college campuses. Yeah. And can either of you speak a little bit further to the 30 by 30 initiative? If we wanted to kind of watch the progress, would we be watching the UN? Is that where it sits? The initiative, like, is that the focal point where the news would come? Okay, this is our next step. This is our, whatever development of initiatives. Does it come out of the UN?
So internationally, yeah, the working paper I described for the Convention on Biological Diversity from last year is being considered at a Council of Parties later this year. So I don't remember the exact date, but later this summer or early fall, there will be a big UN meeting for all 193 of those signatories. There's also, within the next few weeks, a lot of the 30 by 30 United States deadlines of charge the Secretary of the Interior to come up with a plan and stuff like that. Those initial reports will also be coming out. And if you follow basically any environmental organization, you will be hearing about that either excitedly or doesn't go far enough, or given the nature of the challenges, probably a little of both. But those are kind of the two tracks to follow there.
Great, thank you. All right, who's ready with a question? Don't be shy.
While I'm thinking about that, I might follow up with what Micah just said, in that this kind of information is not hard to find online. You know, you can open your computer or your phone, and just open a browser and search for 30 by 30, or search by the Convention Biodiversity, or search for any of those terms within it, and find various statistics and updates and news and stuff like that. And that's all really exciting. Speaking for myself, I do that when I remember to do that when I have a reason and a need. Like, I don't sort of like after supper, hey, I wonder how the 30 by 30 thing's going, I'll check. Like, I just don't do that because I'm busy, I'm distracted, I don't know. So having a reason to do it is what gets me over that very tiny threshold of learning it. And it strikes me that, you know, if I wanted to be a person who thought about this, I would probably think about it better if I was part of a pollinator garden club. If I was part of a garden club or something like that, or part of the, you know, I was a member of a pollinator pathway group in my neighborhood. And if we had some goals that we were working for, you know, like Poughkeepsie could have a 30 by 30 Poughkeepsie plan, right? And there's no reason we couldn't, just like Micah said. And then that would sort of incentivize us to be thinking along these lines and staying up to date on the news, and perhaps, you know, something about.
Great point.
Yeah, just one thing I will also add. I know I got Jewel the slides earlier. If you're able to send those out, I'll just share screen briefly. There is a sources slide I put at the end because, as I mentioned before most of you joined, I am married to a librarian, so I know I cannot get away without citing my sources when I'm talking. So there are a number of other things that I think we'll be able to get out down the line, just to kind of give you further reading, bookmark them, check them every now and then, and you'll have more than you ever knew you wanted.
Terrific. Yes, I will send the entire slideshow out with my next email to everyone. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, questions? Oh my, really? Are we so shy tonight? Nobody? Well, Mary Ann, I'll just keep right on going here. What is your impression of the depth of understanding of your students coming in to your classes in geography or in environmental studies? Like, do you find them to be perhaps better educated in these issues than students 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or not? I mean, what are you finding in the students?
I think yes. In that partly information's, you know, getting easier and easier to come by as time goes on, right? Like, even a decade ago, I mean, when was the iPhone invented? 2011 or 2007, or like you know, like people didn't have ready access to the internet in their pockets even not that long ago. So that's a part of it. More than that, I think that the conversations have evolved and advanced. Like, expectations have risen in sort of a virtuous cycle, a virtuous spiral, where people want to feel good about themselves and about their communities and about what they're doing. And so that means that people are interested in improving upon past ideas about what needs to be done. And so I think that they're like, the students are, it's not that they know the details. It's not that they have a thorough understanding of the logic behind a lot of these things, but they have a general sense. And I think a lot of the general sense comes from things like social media, where they sort of hear people talking about stuff. And they kind of just sort of know, you know, they kind of know about some of these big environmental social justice issues in a way that sort of the conversation hadn't gotten there yet a few years ago, I think.
Interesting. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's interesting.
So let's see. We have in the chat from Rosemary. How would you start a local pollinator club?
Well, since I'll start with that one, and Micah can chime in, since I said it first. But the town of Poughkeepsie has a pollinator pathway committee.
Yep.
And I would get in touch with the committee and say, what do we do? Like, who are you? What do you suggest? And where do we go? And they would say, I don't know. Let's think of this. And they probably would help you invent a path and invent, a way to spread the idea. I mean, it's a great question, and I think that the answer is not known, but I think it would not be hard to come up with. I mean, how many garden clubs are there in the world? There's a lot of garden clubs, right? I'm not in one. My mother-in-law's in one, and she's like always exchanging plants and selling plants and having tea with her garden club people, right? Like, I know this happens.
Mm-hmm.
And when I retire, I'm totally there. But I think that would be another avenue to join a garden club and sort of transmogrify that a bit.
Yep. Good. All right. Another question. You mentioned the importance of local action, which is great. How do you suggest we can make the largest positive environmental impact, perhaps through public policy? So that's two questions. How can we make the largest positive environmental impact as individuals?
I'll jump in with that, and I will acknowledge I started my career at state institutions where I had to be way more guarded, so I apologize for any hesitancy it takes me in getting out an answer to this. But I think there's a good mixture of both. Obviously, like the work you do initially just for yourself or for your area, I mean, like for your house, for instance, is a good place to start. But I think for me, it's really you see the biggest success when you're looking at like coalition building, and it doesn't have to be a direct political coalition, something like the Pollinator Club, for instance, or I know town of Poughkeepsie has a climate smart communities task force that's always, willing to engage with, citizens. Like there's so many different areas where you can start to maybe get people together. And then my experience working with legislators, first of all, is that your local representatives love to hear from you because they love to hear from constituents a lot. It's a great thing. But, if you have 15 people who are the Pollinator Club saying, we should change I'm making something up right now from my previous town, and I still have a chip on my shoulder, saying we should change the laws so that having 12 inches of grass in your backyard behind a privacy fence is allowed and doesn't get a citation from the city for violating those sorts of purposes. I think there's all sorts of things like that when you're talking about like the biggest environmental impact. I think I guess the other piece of it is also find something you care about. If you're excited about pollinators, I know we keep talking about it, but like if pollinators are your thing, that enthusiasm is going to make you a much, much more convincing advocate for it than if it's something you're not really interested in. So when you're looking at all of the great global challenges, I mean, both the exciting and the frustrating and the exciting thing about sustainability and environmental action is there are so many different ways to tackle the issue, and no one person is going to be able to be an advocate for all of them, no matter how big your platform is. And so if there's something that excites you, run with it, whether it's pollinators, whether it's low embodied carbon concrete, not to keep harping on that, whether it's innovative financing solutions for carbon offsetting, which is one of mine, but I won't give you a diatribe about it. There's all sorts of different things. I guess if that's not too broad, find what you're passionate about, find a few people that also are, and, not to sound like a higher ed person here, benchmarking best practices, but look at what other places are doing. Look at what local towns in the area have done. Look at what other communities have, because that also makes it a lot easier to bring it to your legislators. If you say all the cool kids are doing this, it's a much different sell than if you're saying we should do it because it's the right thing. Not to sound too cynical on this beautiful Wednesday night, but the competition and competitiveness is a very powerful tool. I don't know, Marianne, other thoughts?
I totally agree with that. Competition is totally, yeah. We've definitely done that. Like, hey, look at Vassar administration. Marist is doing this. New Falls is doing that. We've totally played that card. And I agree. I guess another thing, part of the reason that the garden club is a thing is that it's social. Like, you have to have fun. You have to have fun doing it, and that's part of how enthusiasm comes. And doing something social is fun. It actually is. And after a year of pandemic, you've forgotten that. But like, I just came from an environmental studies gathering after their theses, and like, it was really fun to hang out with people, and I'd forgotten that. So that's a big motivator. And actually, one of the theses, one of the theses was about writing songs about a river. And she cited Pete Seeger and said, a good song reminds us what we're fighting for. That's
nice.
Right. Pete Seeger was a smart guy, right? And the who would think you're setting out to do policy? I'm going to teach people how to change the world. I'm going to teach you to play the banjo, and it's going to be your tool to change the world. Like, really? But look what happened, right? I mean, that helped make the Clean Water Act happen. I don't know. I mean, help all sorts of ways. So like, having fun, doing social things, like enthusiasm, things that, keep your heart in it, definitely are part of it. I guess the other thing I would also add is that one of the things that I've learned over time is that if there's something that you care about and you're busy in a job, you can also use your job to push that thing a lot of times. Like, if you work in an office and you wish you had people talk to you about pollinator pathways, you can probably get some plantings in the front boulevard or in the window boxes or on the roof, or you can, and that will get conversations going. And that definitely, anything you have that gets conversation going amplifies your effectiveness, for sure. Calling your legislators is definitely a way to amplify your power. It is.
I really love the advice of finding what you're passionate about and having fun with other people, like make it a social thing. I think that is all just so powerful, and helps you keep your energy and your drive, sustains you in whatever work you're doing through those rough times when you hit a brick wall. You got to have people around you. You've got to have that.
Somebody with your back.
Yep. Good. Someone else have a question for us tonight?
I have a question for any of you, which is how did you come to having a 30 by 30 conversation from the Tallamy book? Sort of what brought you to this, and when did you guys spend time on it?
I was trying to find the chapter this afternoon where he mentioned it, and I couldn't find the chapter, but he did talk about the 30 by 30 initiative in the book, and we just sort of glossed over it when we had our book discussion. But when I asked people, well, what other topics do you want to learn more about? That was one of them, because we just didn't have time to spend on it when we first discussed the book. The book is so rich, full of detail, and there was so much to go to discuss.
Yeah, actually, here's another question for the group. How many of you use the Seek app on a mobile device, on a phone or whatever? The Seek app. Anybody use the Seek app? Micah, you've used it perhaps?
Only not enough to be an expert.
I'm also not an expert, but it is super fun. It is super fun.
Okay, how are you saying S?
I'm going to put it in the chat.
Good, thank you.
And it's just the Seek.
Okay.
And so you can go to your app store or whatever and look for the Seek app. And it is, my phone is somewhere. Oh, my phone's over here. Hang on. It is about identifying species, identifying plants and animals. Okay. And so let's see, it opens up and it's sort of like, I don't know if you can see that, it looks sort of like that. And you can use your phone and take a picture of something. And you can just sort of hold it over it. Like I can see some orange flowers in there. I could probably hold my phone over the orange flower picture, and it would tell me what species it was if I could. So the advantage of this is that for all those, hawk moths that I don't know, or caterpillars that I don't know anything about, it can help me identify them. And the thing is that once you start putting names on things, then you start remembering them better. And once you start remembering them better, then you start thinking about the relationships and understanding what's going on. And the more you do that, the more exciting it gets. So, and the thing is that it's the kind of thing, you could use it in academic college research if you wanted. But you can also give it to your 10-year-old and say, here, what's in the backyard? And they would have a good time too. So it's for everybody. And actually, if you look at the website for the Seek app, and just like you can find the website, and it was put together in an effort to do exactly this. Like there's a Netflix series on the Living Planet, maybe, that I haven't seen, but I would love to. It's David Attenborough, Living Planet or something. And it's really in service of this biodiversity thing. Initiative globally. And so they put this app out so that it's free, there's no ads, and they want everybody to be looking for biodiversity in their backyard.
Fantastic. Yeah, Rosemary says, yes, I use the app. And Ilana says, yeah, that's really cool. I've been asking the DEC to help me identify different wildlife species. I don't know what they are. I just emailed them, but this is much more efficient. Way to go. All right.
Yeah. And Jen Rubo is the one that told me about it.
Yes.
And
yes.
She uses it, and yeah.
Okay.
You can even take off of a photo that you have. So.
And then is that also where you can log that you've seen that particular flower or that particular bird at that particular spot, so it geolocates, and then you build up a cache of spottings for something? Okay.
And there's little competitive badges that you can acquire, by getting better. Yeah. Everybody responds to those.
Nice. Very good. All right. Who else has a question? Anyone? Well, here we are. It's almost 7 o'clock, so I guess it's okay. We do have a comment. It's been wonderful to hear from today's speakers. Thank you so much. Awesome. Yes, I do appreciate Marianne and Micah taking the time to prepare and to spend this hour with us today and to share your expertise and your passions. And we wish you well in your work at Vassar. And thank you for inspiring and sharing time and information with us. I will be sending the Micah's PowerPoint out to everyone as well, so you can be looking for that. And I think that's it for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Good night.